In the seemingly idyllic neighborhood of Elmwood Grove, the quiet facade of suburban life shattered in the early hours of May 12, 2080, when police discovered the violent aftermath of a deadly love triangle. In this tragic tale, passion and jealousy erupted between two neighbors who ultimately turned against each other in a brutal showdown. At the center of it all was Elise Marlowe, a lonely housewife whose yearning for connection drew her down a dark and dangerous path. This story examines the dangerous liaisons and explosive consequences of one woman's quest for companionship. In the quiet neighborhood of Elmwood Grove, Elise Marlowe's life appeared perfect from the outside. A spacious house, a well-manicured lawn, and a successful husband, William, who was respected in his field. But behind closed doors, Elise was lost in a haze of loneliness that had slowly crept over her like a shadow. William was everything Elise had once dreamed of: ambitious, driven, and deeply intelligent. But his career as a financial advisor often swallowed up his time. He worked late into the night, arriving home with only enough energy to exchange a few words before falling asleep, his mind already shifting to the next day's work. Days turned into months, and Elise found herself in a routine of quiet breakfasts and lonely evenings, longing for connection, but trapped by the expectations of her role as a devoted wife. Her marriage had not always felt so distant. In the early years, William would surprise her with flowers, weekend trips, or an unexpected day off. But as his career grew, their life shifted toward a single-minded pursuit of success. Elise watched her husband's attention drift further and further from her, slipping through her grasp. She filled her days with gardening, volunteering at the local animal shelter, and hosting occasional gatherings for the neighbors, hoping these activities might distract her. Yet, an emptiness gnawed at her, a need for companionship, validation, and excitement that her life no longer provided. In the March 2008, Elmwood Grove held its annual block party, a lively event where the neighborhood came together to mark the beginning of spring. That year, Elise dressed with unusual care, her mood brightened by the chance to step outside her familiar routine. She hoped, even if subconsciously, that the event might add a spark of excitement to her otherwise unchanging life. It was at this gathering that Elise first met Daniel Weston and Caleb Price, two men whose lives were as contrasting as their personalities. Daniel Weston was a mechanic, rugged and outspoken, with hands calloused from years of manual labor. He had a hard edge to him, one that intrigued Elise from the moment she saw him. Unlike her husband, Daniel exuded a rawness that seemed grounded in a different reality, one not consumed by long hours at an office or endless meetings. He'd moved to the neighborhood only recently, and while he was married, it was known that his relationship was rocky, marked by frequent arguments that sometimes spilled onto the street for neighbors to overhear. He was open about his frustrations with life, quick to speak his mind without caring for appearances. To Elise, who was bound by the constraints of appearances and composure, Daniel's authenticity was electrifying. Caleb Price, on the other hand, was everything Daniel was not. An architect with a refined demeanor, Caleb had an easy charm and an elegant presence that made him popular in the neighborhood. He had a seemingly perfect family, 2 young children, a beautiful wife, and a career that allowed him both prestige and flexibility. Yet, as Elise spoke with him that night, she sensed a restlessness in Caleb, He was personable and attentive, focusing entirely on her words as they exchanged polite small talk. His gaze lingered just a second too long, revealing a hidden intensity behind his polite smile. Unlike the rough edges of Daniel, Caleb was polished and thoughtful, a man whose attentiveness felt like a balm for Elise's loneliness. As the evening progressed, Elise found herself drawn deeper into conversations with both men. She felt a warmth that had long been absent in her life, a spark of attention that reignited her sense of self. The way they looked at her, each in his distinct way, reminded her that she was still desired, still alive. It was thrilling, yet unsettling, a sensation that lingered long after the block party ended. A few weeks after the block party, Elise's thoughts continued to drift back to Daniel, to the rawness he embodied and the sense of escape he represented. By mid-April, their paths began to cross more frequently, at the grocery store or the local coffee shop. Their conversations were brief, often just polite exchanges about the weather or neighborhood gossip. But there was an undercurrent that both felt and neither acknowledged. It was on an overcast morning that their relationship crossed a line. Elise was at the store, picking up groceries, when she ran into Daniel. There was a casualness to their interaction, but as they stood in the narrow aisle, their hands brushed, a small, accidental touch that sent a thrill through Elise. It was a moment suspended in time, one that left her breathless and uncertain. Days later, she found herself at Daniel's garage, ostensibly for a minor repair on her car. The excuse was flimsy, but she was drawn to him, compelled by a need she barely understood. Daniel wasted no time. His desire was clear and unrestrained. Their encounters were brief, but intense, filled with a passion that made her feel alive again. They met in hidden spots, his garage, a secluded part of the park, or sometimes in the alleyway between their homes. With each rendezvous, Daniel grew more possessive, his intensity masking a need that mirrored her own. He began asking probing questions about her life, about her husband, about her other friendships, suspecting that she might not be his alone. Elise felt herself sinking deeper into a connection with him, one that offered an escape from her otherwise quiet, predictable existence. Yet, even as she surrendered to the thrill, she was haunted by a vague unease, sensing that Daniel's passion could easily turn dark. He wasn't just a man seeking comfort. He was a man haunted by his own discontent, someone who clung to her as though she were his only refuge. In the middle of May, just as spring began to fade into summer, Elise found herself growing closer to Caleb as well. Their connection was different, softer, subtler, like a dance that neither rushed nor forced. Caleb would stop by her house with small gestures of kindness, dropping off flowers for her garden or stopping to chat during his evening walks. His attention was gentle but unwavering, a consistent presence that contrasted with the raw energy she shared with Daniel. Unlike her encounters with Daniel, her relationship with Caleb developed gradually. It started with long glances across the yard, small gestures of friendship that slowly deepened. Elise initially thought Caleb viewed her simply as a friend, someone he could talk to about the stress of his job or his family life. Yet, as the days grew warmer, so did the nature of their interactions. Their conversations took on an intimate quality as Caleb revealed the frustrations of his seemingly perfect life. An absent wife, the pressures of his career, and his struggles to reconcile who he was with who he was expected to be. Over time, Elise noticed a shift in his gaze, a lingering look that hinted at something more than friendship. Caleb began to bring her thoughtful gifts, leaving notes on her porch with poetry or small drawings, signs of an affection he was careful to conceal from others. His approach was careful and calculated, a deliberate seduction that contrasted with Daniel's spontaneous passion. Caleb's attention to her needs, his sensitivity to her loneliness, made her feel cherished in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She felt torn, her heart caught between the raw intensity of Daniel and the comforting warmth of Caleb, each man filling a void in her life that had long been neglected. Their connection intensified without words, their feelings evident in every shared glance, every lingering moment. Elise felt herself caught in a delicate balance, one that both thrilled and terrified her. She knew she was in too deep, yet she couldn't pull herself back. Each man offered her something she craved, something that her life had denied her for far too long. As spring slipped into summer, Elise's life was no longer the quiet existence she had once known. She was caught in a dangerous dance with two men whose affections fed her yearning, but came with a growing intensity that hinted at inevitable disaster. By July, the delicate balance Elise had tried to maintain between Daniel and Caleb had started to unravel. The secrecy that once thrilled her now weighed on her like a constant burden. Each man, fueled by his own desires and insecurities, began to sense the presence of the other, and the trust that once underscored her hidden relationships shifted into suspicion and jealousy. Daniel, with his fiercely possessive nature, grew increasingly agitated. Elise's time with Caleb, no longer hidden as carefully as before, didn't go unnoticed by him. He questioned her often, his words edged with frustration and barely concealed anger. His demands became insistent. He needed assurance that he was the only man in her life. Their meetings, once an escape filled with desire, now left her feeling anxious, weighed down by his expectations. As the summer days grew longer, Daniel's demeanor darkened, his eyes following her every move, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Meanwhile, Caleb, with his quiet charm, observed this shift in Elise as well. While he wasn't as overt as Daniel in his possessiveness, he wielded his influence over her more subtly. He played on her emotions, quietly asserting his own control, finding small ways to manipulate her into spending more time with him, into trusting him more than anyone else. Caleb recognized Daniel's jealousy, though he feigned ignorance. He enjoyed the power he had over Elise, using it to fuel his own need for dominance in the relationship. Caleb's approach was calculating, his control masked under a pretense of care and understanding. He never confronted her directly, preferring instead to toy with her emotions, subtly reminding her of Daniel's volatility. What had begun as exhilarating for Elise now felt like a storm she couldn't escape. Her life, once filled with monotony and loneliness, was now entangled in a web of lies and simmering hostilities, her two worlds colliding. Elise grew paranoid, feeling the weight of their suspicions, the intensity of their scrutiny. She started glancing over her shoulder, anticipating the confrontation she knew was inevitable. Her once hidden love life was now a constant source of dread, and she could feel the walls closing in. The pressure finally took its toll. By September, Elise's emotional state had fractured under the constant weight of secrecy and tension. The love triangle, once a forbidden thrill, had eroded her peace of mind. leaving her emotionally drained and visibly shaken. Her usual calm demeanor faltered, and her once pristine appearance grew disheveled, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and endless worry. One evening, unable to contain the turmoil any longer, Elise turned to her husband, William. She tried to articulate the loneliness that had consumed her for years, the distance that had widened between them. She spoke of the emptiness she felt, of the neglect that had left her vulnerable, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. William, always wrapped up in his own world, dismissed her concerns as emotional indulgence, unaware of the internal struggle tearing his wife apart. His inability to see her pain, his quick dismissal of her feelings, pushed Elise further toward the men who had, however imperfectly, filled the void in her life. With William's rejection fresh in her mind, her emotions spiraled out of control. The composure she had once clung to slipped, giving way to unexpected outbursts and emotional displays that began to draw the attention of neighbors. People in the neighborhood whispered about her odd behavior, the way she seemed distracted, burdened. Elise felt like a stranger in her own life, losing herself as she became trapped between two intense possessive relationships. In January, the simmering tension finally surfaced. William, oblivious for so long, stumbled upon cryptic messages on Elise's phone. While he chose not to confront her directly, the discovery left him troubled, casting doubt over his previously steadfast confidence in his marriage. He started noticing her unexplained absences, the way she seemed distracted, disconnected. Suspicion took root in him, although he struggled to reconcile his concerns with the woman he thought he knew. At the same time, Daniel's worst fears were confirmed when he found undeniable evidence of Elise's involvement with Caleb. During one of their encounters, he noticed small but telling signs: a cufflink that was unmistakably Caleb's, and a cologne bottle, half used, bearing the distinct scent he associated with the other man. The discovery was a blow to his pride and a threat to his sense of control. His love for Elise, which had already morphed into possessiveness, now flared into rage. The betrayal he felt was all-consuming, twisting his emotions into a dangerous mix of jealousy and resentment. His thoughts darkened as he imagined Caleb's place in Elise's life, filling him with a growing determination to put an end to the affair, one way or another. Elise's world was now a volatile powder keg, and she could sense the danger looming. She felt trapped, tethered to two men whose emotions threatened to spiral out of control. Her carefully constructed double life had cracked, and there was no way to repair it. Each day, she braced herself for the inevitable collision, feeling the tension building in both Daniel and Caleb. By early March, the rivalry between Daniel and Caleb had reached its breaking point. The confrontation, long in the making, took place on the night of March 10th. Under the cover of darkness, each man made his way to a secluded area near the neighborhood, a place familiar to both, yet hidden enough to keep their clash away from prying eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and unspoken rage as they approached one another, the reality of their shared involvement with Elise hanging between them like a dark cloud. Neither man tried to hold back his anger. The resentment that had built up over months erupted, and their confrontation quickly escalated from heated words to a brutal exchange of blows. They fought with a ferocity fueled by months of jealousy and obsession, each one determined to assert his dominance. The fight spiraled into chaos as they grabbed whatever objects they could find, a wrench, a large rock, using them as weapons in their desperate attempt to overpower each other. The struggle was vicious and relentless, each man inflicting blows without restraint. The darkness provided cover, but it also concealed the brutality, muffling their grunts and cries, leaving only the sound of fists meeting flesh and metal clashing against bone. The rage in each of them was primal, a culmination of months of rivalry that had finally boiled over. By the time dawn began to break, the confrontation had taken its fatal toll. Both men lay bloodied and battered, their bodies evidence of the rage that had consumed them. Each bore the brutal marks of the other's fury, their lives claimed by the same intensity that had drawn them to Elise in the first place. When the police arrived that morning, they found two men who had destroyed each other, their lives bound together by jealousy and desire, and ultimately by death. In the aftermath, Elise was left to face the consequences of her double life, haunted by the knowledge that her pursuit of connection had led to devastating, irreversible loss. Her life would never return to the calm it once held, forever scarred by the tragic end of the men who had been her escape. The neighborhood, once quiet and orderly, now bore the weight of a story it would never forget. On March 12, 2009, just 2 days after the shocking discovery of the bodies, the police arrived in Elmwood Grove to begin a full-scale investigation into the deaths of Daniel Weston and Caleb Price. The violent scene they encountered was a stark contrast to the quiet neighborhood, where lawns were meticulously trimmed and fences neatly painted. Neighbors gathered at the edge of their driveways, casting uneasy glances toward the house where police cars now lined the street. The atmosphere was thick with tension and morbid curiosity, and whispers of Elise's involvement began to spread before the officers had even stepped inside. Detectives moved methodically, interviewing every neighbor, every friend, and every person who might have a piece of the puzzle. Elise's name surfaced almost immediately. Many neighbors had noticed her interactions with both men, piecing together small moments they'd previously dismissed. A few shared stories of seeing Elise with Danielle at his garage, while others recounted how Caleb had frequently stopped by her home, lingering longer than what seemed normal for a married man. As details emerged, the idyllic image of Elise as a devoted wife shattered, replaced by a darker reputation, one that painted her as the orchestrator of a deadly love triangle. Over the next few weeks, the detectives delved into Elise's personal life, uncovering the secrets she had tried to keep hidden. Neighbors recounted hushed conversations and strange behaviors, speculating on her motives and the depth of her involvement. Some recalled seeing her demeanor shift over the past year, her once bright smile replaced by a distant expression, her previously sociable nature fading into quiet withdrawal. Friends who had once shared their lives with her now found themselves hesitant to speak in her defense. Gossip spread like wildfire, fueled by a mix of suspicion and judgment, and the nickname Black Widow of Elmwood Grove began to echo through the neighborhood. To outsiders, Elise was now the woman who had lured two men into her web, ensnaring them with promises and affection, only to leave them dead in her wake. She became the center of a scandal that was discussed over coffee and whispered about at church. Her story, a twisted tragedy that consumed the lives of those around her. As April approached, the authorities sifted through the evidence they had gathered. Interviews, neighborhood observations, and fragments of Elise's private life. By the end of the month, however, it became clear there was no direct evidence tying Elise to the actual confrontation. They found her morally questionable, perhaps reckless, but not criminally liable. On April 10th, they formally dropped her as a suspect, leaving her free from legal culpability, but far from exonerated in the eyes of her community. The damage had been done. The Black Widow image clung to her like a shadow, altering the way she was perceived and ensuring her place as. Just 5 days after the police cleared her as a suspect, William Marlowe, Elise's husband, packed his belongings and quietly left. For William, the investigation had brought an unbearable reality to light. The image of the life he thought he had, a steady, predictable marriage, was a facade, shattered by the revelation of his wife's hidden affairs. He had seen the detectives at their doorstep, had heard the whispers, had endured the awkward glances from friends and colleagues who now knew the darkest secrets of his marriage. William's departure was swift and silent. He didn't speak to Elise about her actions. He didn't demand explanations or offer forgiveness. There was no confrontation, no accusations. He simply gathered his things, packed them into his car, and drove away, leaving Elise in the echoing silence of their once shared home. For William, leaving was an escape, a way to salvage his dignity and distance himself from the scandal that now defined his wife. Elise watched as he drove away, the weight of her isolation pressing down on her. She had lost not only her lovers, but now her husband as well, the person who had been her anchor, even in the coldness of their marriage. Standing alone in the empty house, she felt the full force of what she had lost, not just her reputation, but the stability of a life she had once taken for granted. By May, the impact of the events on Elise's life was profound. She was left alone in her house, where every corner seemed to hold memories of a life that no longer existed. The once lively space felt haunted by the whispers of Daniel and Caleb, reminders of the tangled relationships that had led to their deaths. In her mind, she could still feel their presence, the intense gaze of Daniel, the calm manipulation of Caleb. The memories clung to her, refusing to fade, like ghosts, bound to the walls of her home. The neighborhood, once welcoming, had turned against her. People who once smiled at her now looked away, crossing the street to avoid her. Children who had once played on her lawn now avoided her property, warned by their parents to steer clear of that woman. Elise was no longer part of the community. She was a pariah, a source of scandal that everyone was eager to forget. Grocery shopping became an ordeal, filled with sidelong glances and stifled whispers. Friends she had once confided in now looked at her with suspicion or pity, as if her mere presence might bring them harm. Inside the house, Elise's days stretched into lonely, unchanging routines. She rarely ventured out, preferring the solitude to the judgmental eyes of the community. She spent hours wandering from room to room, lost in memories that replayed endlessly in her mind. She thought of William, of the life they had built together, and wondered if she could have saved it, if she had made different choices. Her thoughts drifted to the nights with Daniel, the thrill of his intensity, and the quiet comfort of Caleb. the way he had made her feel seen. But now, in the silence, the excitement was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that gnawed at her. Elise found herself haunted by guilt. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was to blame, that her desire for connection had set the tragic events in motion. The weight of their deaths bore down on her, and she became consumed by regret, reliving each decision that had brought her to this point. Her world became a shadow of its former self, a bleak existence marked by solitude and shame. By the end of 2009, Elise had faded into a life of near invisibility. Her once vibrant presence in the neighborhood had diminished to a figure glimpsed only through drawn curtains, a solitary silhouette moving through a house filled with memories and regrets. She became a cautionary tale among the residents, a story parents shared in hushed tones to warn against the dangers of forbidden desires. The following months were no different. As 2010 arrived, Elise's isolation remained unbroken. Her life forever changed by the choices she had made and the lives she had touched. Her days passed in a blur of silence and emptiness, each one a reminder of the passion that had once filled her world, now replaced by an unyielding loneliness. The neighborhood continued on, moving past the tragedy, but Elise was left behind, living in the shadow of her actions, her life now a solitary existence, haunted by memories that refused to let her go. The Lonely Housewife's Affair, with two neighbors, is a chilling examination of how repressed desires and unchecked emotions can tear through lives, turning love and jealousy into lethal weapons. The story of Elise, Daniel, and Caleb serves as a haunting reminder that beneath the surface, even the calmest waters may hide the deadliest secrets. Cheating is bad enough, but having multiple cheating partners is just extreme. Like the case where a doctor's secret affair with 3 young women ended in obsession and murder. Make sure to check out that case and, of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.